Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the short story The Inn with No Escape, narrated by Jim. The summer seemed to pass by too quickly, but the stifling atmosphere of the city hadn't left. The towering skyscrapers, the busy streets filled with people, and the chaotic sounds of New York had worn down the group's spirits. Michael sat on the balcony of his 12th-floor apartment, taking the last sip of his beer in heavy silence. Deep down, there was an unnameable void, a sense of boredom and fatigue that his mundane office job couldn't fill. He knew he needed something different, a break from reality, and perhaps his friends felt the same. Their lives, young people living in one of the world's biggest cities, felt trapped by endless responsibilities and obligations. Lila, the heart of the group, was a freelance artist who had lost her inspiration amidst the cramped buildings. Josh, the group's most humorous and optimistic member, had recently grown unusually quiet, weighed down by the pressure of managing a small cafe. Katie, Lila's best friend, who always sought meaning in life through adventures, also seemed tired of short trips to nearby places. And finally, there was Michael, the one who always felt responsible for keeping the group together. This trip was his way to restore balance.
I've been thinking a lot, and I think we all need a little escape.
Michael spoke up, breaking the heavy silence in the apartment. They had gathered there as usual, but today, the atmosphere felt heavier than ever.
Escape?
Lila raised an eyebrow, but the slight smile on her lips showed she understood what Michael was implying.
You're thinking about a trip, aren't you?
Exactly.
Michael nodded.
A long trip out of the city, somewhere far from the familiar suburbs.
Josh, lounging on the sofa, shrugged.
We really do need that. This past week, life has just felt like a boring loop. But where do we go? We've been to almost every place nearby.
Katie's eyes lit up as she leaned forward.
I know a place. It's not on the list of popular tourist spots, but I've heard it's amazing. The forested mountains outside Pennsylvania. Quiet, remote, and best of all, mostly untouched.
Pennsylvania?
Josh laughed.
I thought you were going to suggest some tropical beach or something. But if it's the mountains, why not?
Lila sat silently, looking out the window. She didn't want to admit it, but her mood had been plummeting lately. Her paintings were becoming emptier, as if she had lost all inspiration. A long trip might be the chance she needed to find herself again. And Michael, her closest friend, had suggested it at the perfect time.
All right.
Lila finally spoke up.
I agree. We should go before winter arrives. Nothing's worse than being stuck in the snow.
And so, after just a few minutes of discussion, the group made their decision. A week later, they were on their way, unaware that this trip would not just be an escape from the city, but a journey far darker than they could imagine. A week later, Michael's SUV rolled out of New York, winding along the quiet roads of the suburbs, leaving behind the noise and chaos of the big city. The early morning sky was bright blue, with soft golden sunlight spilling over the endless stretch of asphalt, creating a peaceful, promising scene. But none of them noticed the subtle shift in the air as they moved deeper into unfamiliar territory. From a distance, the mountains slowly appeared with their jagged peaks and dense forests, draped in a mysterious mist. The further they drove, the more desolate and isolated the landscape became as they ventured deeper into the small road leading to the mountains. At first, the atmosphere in the car was cheerful, jokes and music filled the air. But as the afternoon wore on, a quietness gradually took over. Michael, behind the wheel, began to feel an uneasiness building inside, but he didn't say anything. The road became rougher, and the GPS started losing signal. Lila's phone kept blinking with connection errors, something that had never happened before.
Are we still okay?
Katie asked, her voice tinged with concern.
I think so.
Michael replied, though his eyes never left the road ahead.
Maybe we've just gone a little off course, but it's fine. Let's just keep going.
Lila turned around, looking out the window. Outside, the trees seemed to grow denser, forming a dark, impenetrable wall around the car. The sunlight was fading, giving way to the cold, creeping darkness that covered everything. She felt the presence of something strange. Had she seen a shadow move between the trees? The car continued winding down the bumpy, narrow road, deeper and deeper into the mountains. And then, suddenly, the the fuel warning light on the dashboard blinked on. The gas gauge was nearing empty. The sky had turned an ashen gray as the group pulled up in front of the old inn. The scene before them filled them all with hesitation. The house stood isolated among the dense trees, covered in green moss, as if it had been forgotten in darkness for a long time. The ominous silhouette of the house, with its weathered wooden walls and dark windows that seemed to stare back at them, cast an invisible weight on the atmosphere.
Are we really going in there?
Lila whispered, trying to stay calm, but her voice quivered with fear. A chill ran down her spine as she looked at the house. It didn't seem like a place meant for people, more like a trap. Josh, usually the one to crack jokes, was unusually quiet this time. He stepped out of the car and squinted around.
We don't have a choice. We're not sleeping outside tonight.
He forced a slight smile, but it wasn't enough to dispel the unease that hung in the air. Michael, as always, took charge. He felt the need to stay strong for the group, even though a vague sense of fear crept into his heart.
Let's go inside. We just need to spend the night, and by morning we'll head back to the main road. There's nothing to worry about.
His tone was firm, but the way his hand gripped the steering wheel revealed the tension he was holding back. Katie stood next to the car, her eyes locked on the steps leading to the front door. Something felt terribly wrong in this place, though she couldn't quite explain it. A sense of being watched lingered.
Hey, did anyone notice? It's completely silent here. No birds, no wind, no sound at all.
She said, her voice filled with anxiety. Katie's words made the air grow heavier. The group stood still, listening, and indeed, as she said, everything seemed enveloped in an eerie silence. No birds, no wind rustling through the leaves, just a suffocating stillness, as if the forest around them had stopped breathing.
Come on, we need to go inside,
Michael said, breaking the tense silence, and started toward the door. The front door let out a long, creaking groan as Michael pushed it open. Inside, the air was dark and murky, as though the daylight outside could not penetrate. The smell of dampness and rotting would hit their noses as soon as they crossed the threshold, making them all take a step back.
This place is disgusting.
Lila mumbled, covering her nose and looking around the room. The walls were peeling, the paint long decayed, and a large chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, as if it was ready to fall at any moment. It was the main room, with an old wooden table in the center, surrounded by rotting, dusty chairs. Katie was the last to enter, the discomfort growing stronger as her feet touched the floor.
I have a bad feeling about this place,
she said, her wary eyes scanning the room. Josh chuckled dryly, trying to lighten the mood.
We'll make it through the night, no problem. Everyone's going to think I'm the bravest one after this.
Just as he finished speaking, a soft sound echoed from somewhere above. The group froze. The noise was faint but unmistakable and deliberate, as if someone was slowly walking across the wooden floor upstairs.
Don't tell me you guys heard that too.
Josh said, his smile vanishing. Lila's chest tightened.
There's someone up there, isn't there?
Her voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might awaken whatever was lurking. Michael looked up at the ceiling, his eyes tense.
It's probably just the house settling. Old places like this make weird noises.
Katie wasn't convinced.
No, Michael. That was definitely footsteps.
Everyone felt it, but no one said anything more. They just stood there, listening in silence. The footsteps echoed again, this time clearer, and then suddenly stopped.
Maybe someone lives here.
Michael suggested, though he didn't believe his own words.
I'll go check. No need to worry.
Katie looked at him skeptically.
Don't you think if someone lived here, they would have shown up when we arrived?
Maybe they're upstairs.
Michael shrugged, though he couldn't deny that Katie's point made sense. Even so, he stepped toward the staircase. His foot landed on the creaky wooden steps, each groaning under his weight.
We'll come with you,
Lila said, breaking the tense silence. She couldn't let Michael go up alone. They climbed the stairs, each step slow and deliberate. The creaking floorboards echoed in the stillness, as though every sound could cause the entire house to collapse. The higher they climbed, the thicker the tension grew, as if something was waiting for them at the top. As they reached the top of the stairs, the first door on the right suddenly opened. A woman appeared, her hair long and silver, draped over her shoulders, her eyes deep and cold. She wore an old, tattered robe, her wrinkled face framed by a thin, lifeless smile.
Welcome.
Her voice was hoarse and soft, but it sent chills down their spines. Michael stood frozen for a few seconds, holding his breath. The entire group could feel the tension thickening around them. The old woman didn't resemble anyone they had ever met. Something was deeply wrong here, and they could all sense it.
We apologize for coming in unannounced.
Michael said, trying to keep his voice steady.
We're just looking for a place to stay overnight. Our car ran out of gas.
The woman remained silent for a few moments before softly saying,
You may stay the night, but prepare yourselves. This place is not what you think it is.
Her words, along with her hollow smile, felt more like a warning than a welcome. The group stood there, motionless, under the cold presence of the inn. None of them knew that tonight would be the beginning of a nightmare they couldn't escape. The inn was shrouded in darkness as the group decided to head back downstairs after their unsettling encounter with the strange woman. None of them mentioned her again, but an invisible fear had taken hold of their minds, making them quieter and more cautious. The house now seemed more alive, like a strange creature watching them from every hidden corner.
Does anyone feel uneasy?
Katie whispered as they stood in the living room, the light from her phone's flashlight casting shadows on the moss-covered and dusty walls.
I don't like this.
Lila murmured, her hand instinctively gripping Michael's arm as if seeking safety.
That old woman. She said something about preparing ourselves. What do you think she meant?
Michael stayed silent for a moment, his eyes darkening as he tried to find a logical explanation.
Maybe it's just the way she talks. This house is old. It could have gone through many strange things we don't know about.
Maybe she's just trying to scare us.
Josh chimed in, attempting to keep his voice calm, though the underlying worry was evident.
Old people tend to have ghost stories to keep others away. Maybe the house has a past, but nothing's really happening.
But as soon as he finished his sentence, a strange sound echoed from somewhere within the house. Soft footsteps reverberated down the dark hallway behind them, then abruptly stopped, as if someone had been deliberately moving in silence. The group froze, exchanging nervous glances in the heavy silence, their eyes filled with fear.
Did you hear that?
Lila asked quietly, tightening her grip on Michael. Michael nodded, his eyes focused on the hallway. The sound came again, this time clearer, slow, deliberate footsteps, as if someone was moving closer.
Someone's in the house.
Katie mumbled, her eyes wide.
That old woman isn't alone.
Maybe it's someone else, another guest.
Michael suggested, though his voice wavered. He knew something was off but didn't want to admit the truth. Josh stepped forward, raising his flashlight higher, casting its beam down the dark hallway.
We should check it out. If someone's here, at least we'll know we're not alone.
Are you crazy?
Katie hissed, her eyes glinting with fear in the dim light.
We should leave. We don't know what's waiting for us in there.
But before anyone could react, the lights suddenly flickered off. The room plunged into complete darkness, leaving only the sounds of their tense breathing. Lila screamed in panic as she frantically switched her phone's flashlight back on. The dim light slowly returned, but the uneasy tension had already filled the air.
What the hell was that?
Josh yelled, his eyes wide in shock.
I swear my phone battery was full.
Something is really wrong here.
She shrieked, her eyes shining with fear. Michael turned toward the hallway leading to the back of the house.
We need to figure out what's going on. Let's go. We can't just stand here waiting to die.
With no other choice, the group began moving into the dark hallway, where shadows seemed to pull them toward something far more terrifying than they could ever imagine. The atmosphere inside the inn was becoming more suffocating by the minute. After the mysterious laughter echoed from somewhere in the house, the group was plunged into a near panic, with no way out. Each person tried to suppress the fear creeping into every fiber of their being, but none of them could deny the fact that they were trapped here, and filled with strange, inexplicable events. Michael struggled to stay calm, but inside, a wave of anxiety surged.
We need to find a way out of here,
he said sternly.
We can't just stand around waiting for something to happen. There might be another exit, or at least a window we can open.
Katie took a step back, her eyes darting across the dark corners of the room.
But what if there's no way out? Do you feel it? It's like this house doesn't want us to leave.
Don't say that.
Lila interrupted, her voice trembling.
We'll find a way out. We just need to stay calm and not let fear get the best of us.
Josh stood by the door, his hand repeatedly twisting the knob in vain, hoping it would open.
It's like it's locked from the inside. But who could have locked us in? That old woman?
He paused, looking at Michael with concern.
Do you think she did something?
Michael shook his head, trying to make sense of it.
I don't know, but none of us has seen her since we got in here. We need to split up and search, see if there's a window or another exit.
Split up.
Katie asked in alarm.
Are you crazy? We don't know what's happening here. I'm not going anywhere without someone.
Lila nodded in agreement, her eyes shimmering with fear.
We have to stick together. If something happens, we'll be stronger together.
Michael sighed, understanding their concern.
All right, we won't split up, but we need to check each room. Otherwise, we'll be stuck here forever.
With no other choice, the group began their search. The dim light from their phone flashlights illuminated the crumbling walls and cold, long hallways. Each step echoed with creaking sounds on the old wooden floor, adding to the tension in the air. The house felt like a maze. They went from one room to another, but nothing seemed to change. Every door led to similar rooms, with peeling walls, dusty furniture, and no signs of an exit.
We've been through this room already.
Katie shouted, stopping in the hallway as they entered a room she swore they had seen before.
We're just going in circles.
That's impossible.
Michael responded, but even he started to doubt himself. He glanced around the room, recognizing familiar details. A broken chair in the corner, a cracked mirror hanging on the wall.
But it looks like we've been here.
Lila stepped back, her eyes wide with horror.
Maybe we can't get out. Maybe we're trapped in some kind of loop.
Don't say that.
Josh shouted, his voice cracking with fear.
We can get out. We just need to keep trying.
Katie looked at Michael, her eyes filled with desperation.
Michael, you have to have a plan. You're always the one with the plan.
Michael stayed silent, the weight of despair settling on his shoulders. He didn't want to admit it, but even he felt hopeless. There was no way out, and the house seemed to be playing with them. It led them through identical hallways and rooms, as if they were trapped in an inescapable space.
We need to check the basement.
Michael said after a long pause, his voice filled with determination.
Maybe we haven't looked everywhere.
The basement?
Lila asked, her voice trembling.
But what if there's something down there?
Michael took a deep breath.
If we don't go, we'll never know. It's the only place we haven't checked.
Katie shook her head.
I'm not going. There's no way I'm going into this house's basement.
Then we'll go together.
Michael said, trying to maintain calm.
We won't split up, but we have to check. Otherwise, we're out of options.
The group moved toward the staircase leading down to the basement. The wooden steps creaked loudly under their feet, and the air grew colder the deeper they descended into the darkness. The light from their phones barely cut through the thick darkness, illuminating only a few steps ahead. At the bottom of the stairs, a large door loomed before them, covered in dust and rust. Michael reached out to touch the doorknob, and as soon as his hand made contact, the door swung open with a loud groan. No one spoke, but they all felt the cold air seeping out from inside. One by one, they stepped through the doorway, their flashlights shining on the damp stone walls of the basement. It was the only part of the house that didn't resemble the rest. It was cold, silent, and filled with eerie shadows.
What are we even doing down here?
Katie mumbled, her voice thick with fear.
This place is terrifying.
Josh turned around, his flashlight suddenly catching movement in the dark. The group stopped in their tracks, their flashlights sweeping forward. And then they saw it, a tall, shadowy figure, blurry and fast, moving across the far corner of the room before disappearing into the darkness. Lila screamed, her hands trembling as she clung to Michael.
We need to get out of here.
Run.
Michael shouted, grabbing Lila's hand and pulling her toward the door. The group rushed up the stairs in a panic, leaving behind the cold, haunted basement and the strange figure lurking within. But as they reached the top of the stairs, the door in front of them slammed shut with a deafening bang. They were trapped again, and this time, there might be no way out. Thick darkness enveloped the group like a tightening net. The door in front of them slammed shut with a creaking, ominous sound. Every breath became heavy, as if the air around them had been sucked out. The darkness in the house was no longer just silent and indifferent. It seemed alive, as if it was wrapping around and suffocating their every breath, every step. Michael remained at the front, his hands pounding hard on the door, but it didn't budge. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he turned to the others.
"We're stuck,"
he said, his voice strained.
"The door won't open."
What the hell is happening?
Josh shouted, his voice taut with tension.
I can't take this anymore. I need to get out of here.
Katie gasped, leaning against the wall, her eyes wide with fear.
This place is toying with us. It's not just a house. It's keeping us here.
Lila, standing close to Michael, was trembling. She could feel the growing sense of hopelessness filling her mind, piece by piece.
We can't just keep running. If there's no way out, we need to figure out why. There has to be something here. A secret this house is hiding.
Listen, we can't just stand here.
Michael said, trying to regain his composure. He looked into each of their eyes, hoping to reignite some small spark of courage.
We have to keep searching. If this house is keeping us here, there's a reason.
But how do we even know what that reason is?
Katie asked, her voice choking with panic.
The basement.
Lila murmured, her voice vague but determined.
We haven't fully explored the basement. There's something down there. I can feel it.
I don't want to go back there.
Josh said, his eyes wide with fear.
We saw something moving in the darkness. If we go back, we might not come out.
Maybe Lila's right.
Michael replied.
This house is hiding something, and we need to find out what it is. If we don't, we'll never get out of here.
Reluctantly, the group agreed to return to the basement. The atmosphere grew more stifling as they descended once again down the creaky wooden stairs. Every step echoed through the cold, dark space, and their breathing grew more labored with each step. The basement was freezing, filled with the stench of mold and rot. The faint light from their phones barely cut through the thick darkness. Michael stepped forward, shining his flashlight on the rough stone walls. But this time, something was different. In a hidden corner, one section of the wall stood out. It looked newer, as though it had been recently rebuilt.
Look at that.
Lila whispered, her eyes fixed on the wall.
There's something off about this.
This was definitely built recently. Someone didn't want us to find what's behind this.
Katie looked around in horror.
Maybe that's why this house is holding us. There's something behind that wall.
We have to break it down.
Josh said, his voice trembling.
If this is where the secret is, then this is the key.
Michael agreed, searching around until he found a small metal rod. He used it to smash the wall. The stones crumbled, revealing a dark space beyond. A blast of icy air rushed out, carrying with it the stench of decay, like the smell of long decomposed bodies.
What is in there?
Katie whispered, too scared to step closer. Michael raised his flashlight and shone it inside. The beam of light illuminated a horrifying scene. Inside was a small room, its walls covered in strange drawings and symbols, like some kind of occult ritual. In the center of the room was a stone table, and on it lay rotting skeletons, chained as if they had been tortured to death. Lila screamed, raising her hand to her mouth to stifle the sound.
Oh my God, these are the people who were trapped here.
Josh turned away, trying not to vomit.
What the hell? What have we found? Michael stood frozen, his eyes locked on the gruesome scene before him.
This is the secret of the house. It's not just a house. It's a place where twisted rituals took place, where people were killed. Maybe their spirits are trapped here.
Katie's body shook as tears streamed down her face.
We need to get out of here, right now. If we don't, we'll be the next skeletons.
But how do we escape?
Lila asked, her voice trembling with fear.
If these people couldn't get out, how can we?
Michael sat down, his head pounding.
I don't know, but at least we know the truth about this place. We know why it's keeping us here. We need to figure out how to break this curse.
Josh took a step back, his eyes filled with terror.
But how do we even do that? If this is a curse, we can't just break it like that.
Lila looked around, her eyes landing on the symbols covering the walls.
Maybe these are the key. These symbols, they could be the way to break the curse.
Do you think we can use them?
Katie asked, her eyes still glued to the haunting room.
We have to try.
Michael said, standing up.
If we don't do anything, we'll die here. I'm not sure how, but we have to try. It's our only chance.
With no other choice, the group stepped into the small room and began to examine the strange markings on the walls. They didn't know what would happen, but they knew this was their only chance to escape the house, if the house would even let them live. In the suffocating atmosphere of the basement room, time seemed to stop. The rotting skeletons on the stone table lay still, yet their presence felt heavier than ever. The dim light from the flashlights flickered, casting shadows on the strange symbols on the walls, making them appear to twist and writhe unnaturally in the thick darkness. Michael stood in the center of the room, his hands trembling as he tried to keep the flashlight pointed at the mysterious drawings. Each symbol on the wall was a piece of the horrifying puzzle they needed to solve to escape the house. But it seemed like an impossible task, with anxiety and despair creeping into their every breath.
Is there a way? We can use these symbols to break the curse.
Lila whispered, her voice faint in the deadly silence. She glanced around, her eyes darting to every corner of the room, as if an unseen force might jump out and attack them at any moment.
We don't know anything about them.
Josh panted, stepping back toward the door.
These symbols? Who knows what they mean? I don't want to mess with things we don't understand.
Katie remained by the entrance, her eyes filled with terror as she avoided looking directly at what they had uncovered.
How do we know if those symbols will free us? We could be falling into this house's trap.
Michael, trying to suppress his own emotions, looked deeply into his friend's terrified eyes.
I don't know if we fully understand them, but this might be our only chance. If the people before us couldn't escape, maybe they didn't figure out how to use the symbols properly. We don't have any other options.
I feel like we made a mistake from the start.
Josh said, his voice full of despair.
We should never have come here. This isn't a place meant for people. We're being held by something we can't even begin to understand.
Katie remained by the entrance, her eyes filled with terror as she avoided looking directly at what they had uncovered.
How do we know if those symbols will free us? We could be falling into this house's trap.
Michael, trying to suppress his own emotions, looked deeply into his friend's terrified eyes.
I don't know if we fully understand them, but this might be our only chance. If the people before us couldn't escape, maybe they didn't figure out how to use the symbols properly. We don't have any other options.
I feel like we made a mistake from the start.
Josh said, his voice full of despair.
We should never have come here. This is not a place meant for humans. We are being held captive by a force we cannot comprehend.
Katie breathed heavily, tears starting to roll down her cheeks.
Hey, I can't take this anymore. I don't know if we're going to make it out of here alive. Feels like this house is suffocating us, slowly killing us.
Lila turned to Katie, her eyes filled with empathy.
I feel the same way. But if we give up now, we'll be trapped here forever.
The air in the room was so heavy it was almost impossible to breathe. They all knew that the house's haunting wasn't just physical, it was psychological, breaking them down, making them lose their will and their hope.
Don't let it control you.
Michael said, his voice stronger now.
We have to be stronger than this. This house doesn't just want to trap us, it wants to break our spirits. If we give in to the fear, it wins.
But how are we supposed to be strong when this place is eating away at us?
Katie asked, her voice weak and filled with anguish.
I can't handle this anymore.
Josh stepped closer, placing a hand on Katie's shoulder in a gesture of comfort.
We have to try, if not for ourselves, then for each other.
Michael looked at the wall of strange symbols. He knew they might hold the key, but they could also be a trap.
We don't have much time,
he said, his eyes scanning the symbols.
We have to decide quickly.
Lila, with her sensitive intuition, stepped closer to the markings, her eyes focusing on each detail.
I think they're part of a ritual. Maybe there's an order we need to follow.
Are you sure?
Josh asked, his face full of doubt.
No.
Lila replied softly but with determination.
But I can't stand here and do nothing. We're too tired, too drained to keep running. If we don't act, we'll die here.
You're right,
Michael said, his eyes lighting up with hope.
Let's try.
With desperate resolve, the group began experimenting with the symbols. Lila carefully placed her hand on one of the markings, a chill running down her spine. The wall seemed to tremble slightly at her touch, and a strange noise echoed from somewhere in the house.
What just happened?
Katie asked, her voice trembling with fear.
I don't know.
Lila replied, her eyes still fixed on the wall. But I think I did something right.
Keep going.
Michael urged, his face a mixture of hope and concern. Lila continued to touch the other symbols, carefully selecting them based on her instincts and guesses. Each time she touched a new marking, the house seemed to respond, the noise growing louder, as if the building itself was reacting to their actions. Every sound, every slight tremor in the wall made their hearts pound faster. But then, suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the room from nowhere, extinguishing their flashlights. Darkness fell over them, and in the pitch black, mysterious whispers echoed from all directions, as if the house itself was speaking to them.
I don't like this.
Josh said, his voice breaking in panic.
What have we done? What are we waking up?
Katie screamed into the darkness, her cry reverberating through the room.
We were wrong. We shouldn't have touched these things.
Michael tried to stay calm, but he could feel the fear rising in his chest.
We have to keep going. We can't stop now.
Despite being paralyzed with fear, Lila kept moving her hands over the remaining symbols. The wall shook violently, and then there was a loud sound, like something had just been unlocked from deep within the house. A hidden door swung open on the opposite wall, revealing a long, dark hallway leading deeper into the house. The group stood frozen, unsure if they had found an escape or if a new nightmare awaited them ahead. The space before them was now just a cold, dark hallway, stretching endlessly. The secret door had just swung open, revealing a passage none of them wished to face. The group stood silently at the newly opened threshold, each of them grappling with a difficult decision. Should they proceed, or accept that this might be an even more terrible trap? Michael stood at the front, his trembling flashlight beam cutting into the darkness. Each step felt like 1,000 pounds pressing down on him. Though fear was swelling inside him, he knew they had few options left. Behind them, the empty rooms and walls seemed to be coming alive, as if the house was awakening with each passing moment. They couldn't turn back.
We have to go.
Michael said, forcing the words from his throat.
This might be our only way out.
Katie, standing behind him, stifled a sob.
But what if this isn't an escape? What if it's the house's final trap? We've made too many mistakes. Maybe this is just another one.
We don't have a choice.
Michael replied, his eyes shining in the darkness.
We can't stay here. This house will kill us if we stop.
Josh, who had always tried to be tough, could no longer hide his fear.
If we keep going, we might never come back. Look at that hallway.
He pointed at the pitch-black passage with no light at the end.
It looks like it leads straight to hell.
Lila stood silently, her head bowed, a wave of despair flooding her mind. She had tried to be strong, but now everything seemed beyond her ability to cope.
We've been trapped here too long. I don't know if I have the strength to go on.
None of us want to keep going.
Michael said firmly.
But we have to. If we don't, we'll die here.
A tense silence enveloped the group. The sound of their breathing echoed eerily in the still air. It felt as though every sound was being swallowed by the surrounding darkness. They all understood that stepping into that hallway could be the last thing they ever did. Katie stepped back, gripping Lila's arm tightly.
If we go in there, we stay together. No one leaves anyone behind.
Exactly.
Michael agreed.
No one gets left behind.
Finally, after a few moments of hesitation, Michael took the first step into the hallway. The light from his flashlight shone straight ahead, but it couldn't penetrate the thick darkness that engulfed them. Lila, Josh, and Katie followed closely behind him, their hands trembling but still holding onto each other. Each step echoed loudly in the narrow hallway, the creaking of the wooden floor beneath them making them feel as if they were walking on ground that didn't belong to this world. The deeper they went, the heavier the atmosphere became. The cold air wrapped around them, seeping through their clothes, and each breath became quicker, more labored. Josh, who was usually the jokester of the group, could no longer find words. He struggled to keep walking, his legs feeling weak as the cold and fear took over his body.
I don't know if we're even going the right way.
He croaked.
Look at this. The hallway never ends. Where are we going?
Michael paused for a moment, looking around but seeing nothing but endless darkness.
I don't know, but turning back isn't an option.
Lila, who had been trying to stay calm throughout the ordeal, could no longer hold back. She clung tightly to Katie, tears streaming down her face.
I'm so scared.
She whispered.
We shouldn't be here. We never should have come to this house.
Katie didn't know how to comfort her friend. She was terrified too, but she knew there was no turning back.
We have to keep going, Lila.
Katie said softly, trying to steady her voice.
We have to face this.
Suddenly, a loud noise came from behind them. The group whipped around. The secret door they had entered through was now gone, as if it had never existed. The only path left was the one ahead, into the endless darkness.
What the hell?
Josh gasped, his face turning pale.
We can't go back.
Michael said, his voice turning grim.
There's only one way left. We have to keep moving.
Their footsteps echoed through the hallway, each step seemingly stretching out in this strange, unearthly space. They had no idea how long they had been walking, and the further they went, the more desperate they became. Strange whispers began to fill the air, as if the house itself was mocking them, urging them forward without giving them any choice. At last, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a large, dark, cold room. There were no windows, only high walls surrounding them, and in the center of the room stood a stone altar, covered by a black cloth. The space was eerily silent, but they all felt the presence of something that didn't belong in this world.
What is this?
Katie whispered, unable to take her eyes off the altar. Michael stepped closer, but with each step, the air seemed to grow heavier.
I don't know, but maybe this is what the house wanted us to find.
Lila stepped back, a surge of terror washing over her as she sensed a dark energy emanating from the altar.
I think we shouldn't touch it.
Even though Michael felt the same overwhelming fear, he moved closer to the altar.
If this is the answer, we need to know. This might be the way out.
He reached out and touched the black cloth, feeling the cold seep into his bones. A part of him wanted to stop, to turn back, but he knew there was no other way. In that moment, as the cloth was pulled away, the horrifying truth was revealed before them. The object on the altar wasn't just an ordinary item. It was a person, but no longer alive. It was a dried skeleton, with strange symbols carved deep into the bones, as though this person had undergone a brutal ritual before being killed. Lila screamed, stepping back in panic.
We need to get out of here.
But just as she turned to leave, the door slammed shut, the sound echoing throughout the dark space. The house had truly trapped them now, and there was no escape. Katie's voice cracked with terror.
We've gone too far. We can't get out anymore.
Michael turned back, his eyes filled with despair, but also a flicker of faint hope.
We have to do something. We can't just sit here and wait to die. Now, facing the house's most terrifying secret, the group realized they had one final choice. Either confront whatever was waiting for them in this dark room, or die in the house's endless darkness. The large, dark room with the stone altar in the middle had never felt more suffocating. There was no escape, no more theories or faint hopes to rely on. A deadly silence filled the air, with only the desperate gasps of the group echoing in the terrifying stillness. Each of them knew their time was running out. Michael stood still before the skeleton on the altar, his weak flashlight flickering in his hand, reflecting the state of his own mind, fragile and about to break. His eyes stared at the symbols deeply carved into the bones, a strange feeling filling his mind. Maybe this is the house's curse, he whispered, but he was no longer sure of anything. Everything around him seemed to spin, and his consciousness felt as if it was being sucked into an endless darkness. Katie leaned against the wall, trembling with despair. She couldn't take her eyes off the skeleton before her, the gruesome sight burning into her mind, making everything else blur.
Went too far,
she said, her voice trembling with uncontrollable fear.
We're going to die here just like the others. We've stepped into a place that doesn't belong to us.
Josh, who had once tried to stay strong, was now just a shadow of his former self. He stepped back from the altar, his hands trembling as he clutched them together.
We don't deserve this,
he said, his voice filled with bitterness and despair.
All of this, it's a trap. We never had a chance.
Lila, her eyes glistening with tears, stood far from the altar, her body shaking with fear. Shivers ran down her spine as she saw the symbols on the skeleton, identical to the ones she had seen on the walls before.
We made a mistake the moment we entered this house.
She whispered, almost talking to herself.
This house doesn't just want to kill us. It wants to drain our souls, like it did to those before us.
Lila's voice was like a whisper from the darkness, echoing in the empty room. Everything became clearer now. This house wasn't just a house. It was a living entity, an ancient, malevolent force that lured lost souls into its trap. Katie stood up, her eyes growing frantic.
We can't just sit here and wait to die.
She said, nearly shouting.
We have to do something. Anything.
But how?
Josh mumbled, his eyes vacant.
There's no escape. No way to break this curse. We're trapped in our own fate.
Michael turned to look at everyone, his eyes showing helplessness. But deep down, he knew that if they didn't act, the house would win. He couldn't let that happen.
I won't let this house kill us without a fight,
he said, his voice steely.
We're not going to sit still.
He walked closer to the altar and reached out to touch the skeleton. As soon as his hand made contact, a wave of icy cold shot through him, making him shiver. Everything in the room grew even more still, more silent than death. But Michael didn't give up. He began searching for clues, anything that could help them escape. Katie screamed, pointing at the walls around them. The symbols carved into the walls started glowing faintly, the strange characters coming to life, twisting and swirling around the room. Josh stepped back, his eyes wide in confusion.
What the hell is happening?
Lila moved forward, her eyes glowing in the pale blue light from the symbols.
I think we've activated something.
But just as the symbols lit up, a loud roar suddenly erupted from behind them. From the depths of the darkness, a massive shadow began to form, appearing before them like a monster born from the very house itself. Its red eyes glowed, its enormous and ghostly body radiating malevolence. Katie screamed in panic.
Run.
Michael, with no other choice, grabbed Lila and Josh and ran toward the door, but it didn't budge. The shadow grew closer, moving faster, more aggressively, as if it wanted to devour them all.
We're trapped.
Josh yelled, pounding on the door. Michael turned back, sweat pouring down his face.
The door won't open unless we break this curse.
Lila, her eyes filled with desperation, looked up at the glowing symbols on the walls.
We have to complete the ritual. If we don't, we'll never get out.
But what do we do?
Katie shouted, her body shaking with fear. In that brief moment, time seemed to stretch endlessly. Michael, under immense pressure, turned toward the altar, his eyes fixed on the symbols carved into the skeleton. Then he realized something.
These symbols, they're the key,
he said, his voice filled with certainty.
We have to activate them.
Michael stepped forward, placing his hand on the skeleton and tracing the symbols. As he touched each one, the room shook violently, but the giant shadow began to slow, as if it was being restrained by some unseen force.
I think you're doing it right.
Lila shouted, her eyes wide with hope. But time wasn't on their side. The shadow edged closer, its growls echoing throughout the room. Katie had collapsed, her body shaking uncontrollably. Josh stood frozen, his face full of terror, unsure of what to do. Finally, when Michael touched the last symbol, a blinding light erupted from the altar, flooding the entire room. The shadow roared in pain, and then it dissolved into the light. The room fell silent again, with only the faint glow from the symbols left. Lila collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath.
Did we do it?
But just as they thought it was over, a faint sound came from the altar. The skeleton slowly crumbled, and from within, a small object fell, a pocket watch, glowing with a faint light. Michael knelt down and picked up the watch, his eyes locked on its face. But there was no time to think, as the room began to shake even more violently, and the wall behind the altar started to crack, revealing an escape route.
Run.
Michael shouted, pulling Lila and Josh to their feet. They sprinted toward the exit, not knowing where it would lead, but knowing it was their only chance. The hurried footsteps echoed through the long hallway as the group rushed out of the Eerie room, where just minutes before, they had faced death. The air remained thick, cold, and suffocating. The wall behind them had slowly collapsed, revealing an escape route. But none of them knew if this exit would truly lead to freedom, or if it was just another part of the trap that the house had laid. Michael ran at the front, pulling Lila and Josh along. Katie was at the back of the group, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, her body sinking into exhaustion and fatigue. What they had just endured seemed to have broken her will. Katie's eyes were wide with panic, her hands trembling uncontrollably.
I can't run anymore.
Katie gasped, her legs almost giving out beneath her.
We've been running. But we're still not out of this place.
Michael stopped, turning to look at her, his eyes drenched in sweat and exhaustion.
We have no choice, Katie. You have to keep going. Just a little further. We'll find the way out.
But deep in Michael's mind, doubt had begun to take root. With every step he took, it felt as though the house was still controlling their every move, guiding them toward a path with no escape. Yet he couldn't let his friends panic. He had to hold on to hope, however fragile it was. Lila stood behind Michael, her eyes gleaming faintly in the dim light from the phone.
I feel like we've been running forever, but we're still inside this house,
she said, her voice weak and filled with anxiety. Josh, who had always tried to stay strong, now looked just as uncertain.
I feel it too.
He whispered, his eyes fixed ahead, where the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly.
Maybe this house has no exit.
Katie stared at the walls on either side of them, as if they were slowly closing in.
Right. Maybe this is the end. This house wants to keep us forever.
Michael tried to calm himself and the group.
No, we can't stop. I don't know what's waiting for us at the end of this hallway, but we have to keep going. Stopping means death.
Though no one spoke, the air of despair had settled over the group. The house's darkness seemed to have invaded their minds, inch by inch. Every corner, every wall seemed to whisper, urging them to stop and accept their fate. But Michael pressed on, leading the group. They moved through the long, narrow corridor, where the light from their flashlights grew dimmer, and the air became heavier. The floor creaked beneath their feet, each sound echoing back like a reminder of the fragility of life. Then, suddenly, they reached the end of the hallway. A large door appeared before them, heavy and decayed as if it had stood for decades. Michael stopped in front of the door, gripping the handle tightly, his eyes staring at it but too afraid to turn it.
We have no other choice,
he said, his voice trembling. Lila looked at him, her eyes filled with deep fear.
Michael, what do you think is behind this door?
I don't know, but we can't stop here.
Katie stood behind them, breathing heavily as she tried to regain her composure.
If it's another trap, we'll die. But what if it's the real exit?
Josh touched the door, feeling the cold from the rusted metal.
We have nothing left to lose. We have to open it.
Michael nodded and slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open with a groan, as if it hadn't been opened in centuries. They stepped inside. The space within was a large room, but unlike any they had seen before in the house. This room seemed more modern, with clean white walls and a polished floor. In the center of the room stood a large table with neatly arranged chairs, but there was no sign of life. Everything was eerily silent and still.
What is this place?
Lila asked, her voice barely a whisper. Michael walked in slowly, his eyes scanning every detail.
Maybe we've made it out.
Katie wasn't convinced.
But why is it so empty? It doesn't feel like a place where we'd be safe.
The group moved further into the room, their steps slow and cautious. There were no signs of danger, but none of them felt at ease. It was as if they were trapped in another space, another reality.
Look,
Josh suddenly said, pointing toward a large mirror on the wall. They moved closer to the mirror, and what they saw left them frozen in place. In the mirror, their reflections weren't normal. Instead, their shadows were distorted, warped as if they were no longer human. They saw empty eyes, gray skin, and bodies that were little more than exposed bones like skeletons. Lila screamed and stepped back in terror.
What have we become?
Michael stood frozen, his eyes glued to his own image in the mirror.
No, it can't be.
Josh clutched his head, collapsing to the floor, tears streaming down his face.
We've been transformed. We're no longer ourselves.
Katie stood in silence, her eyes locked on the horrifying image in the mirror.
We'll never escape this house. It's taken our souls.
Michael staggered back, his eyes filled with overwhelming despair.
No, it can't be. There has to be a way.
But deep down he knew the truth. This house never intended to let them go. From the moment they entered, their fate had been sealed. Death wasn't the end. The house had taken their souls, trapping them in a never-ending cycle, forever caught between reality and nightmare. Lila collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with utter hopelessness.
We were wrong from the start. We should never have entered this house.
Katie knelt beside her, tears streaming down her face.
We never stood a chance.
Michael stood motionless in the center of the room, his eyes hollow as he stared at the mirror. They had come too far, and now, all that was left was an inescapable end. The room fell into a deadly silence. The house had achieved its goal, claiming the souls of the unfortunate, forever trapped with no way out. The story ends here, but if you found it interesting, feel free to hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share it. And now, it's time to say goodbye.